Oh, stormy night, a crash, a stranger bleeding out. A waitress risks everything to save him, unaware he's a billionaire whose gratitude will spark a life-changing journey of redemption. Welcome to Life Bond Tales. If you like such stories, subscribe. And like the video. Let's start the story. The rain battered the windows of the seaside diner, a small weathered building tucked along a quiet coastal road, its neon sign flickering in the storm. Emily Harper, a 24-year-old waitress with tired hazel eyes, moved slowly as she wiped down the last sticky table, her thin frame aching from a double shift that had stretched past midnight. The diner was empty, the storm keeping even the regulars away, and the only sounds were the rhythmic patter of rain and the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Emily glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m., just minutes from locking up, her mind drifting to her younger sister Lily, who was studying late. For her nursing exams, a dream Emily had quietly sacrificed her own college plans to support. As she reached for her worn raincoat, a deafening crash split the air, metal screeching against asphalt, sharp and violent, halting her breath. Her heart pounded as she rushed to the door, ignoring the rain that soaked her dark ponytail and thin sweater within seconds. Skidding around the corner, her sneakers slipping on wet pavement, she saw him, a man sprawled on the road, his body crumpled like a discarded rag doll, blood pooling beneath his head, mixing with the rain in dark rivulets. His dark jacket was torn, one arm bent unnaturally, and a crumpled bicycle lay a few yards away, its wheels still spinning. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Sir, can you hear me?" No response came, only the shallow rise of his chest, faint and faltering. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911, her voice tight with panic as she told the dispatcher, "There's been an accident. A man's been hit. He's bleeding badly. Please hurry." The rain stung her eyes, but she stayed, pressing her scarf against the gash on his forehead, her stomach churning at the sight of so much blood. She didn't know his name, his story, or why he was alone on this desolate road, but she knew he was alive, and that was enough. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, and as the ambulance pulled up, paramedics rushed to her side, their faces grim. "You called it in?" one asked, and Emily nodded, stepping back, her hands stained red. "He's AB negative," a medic muttered after checking his vitals. "And we're out of that type at the hospital. It's rare. We need a donor fast or he won't make it." Emily's breath caught. She was AB negative, a fact she'd learned years ago when she'd considered donating for her father, only to freeze in fear, a choice that haunted her when he died hours later. "I'm a match," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain, and the medics turned skeptical. "You sure? You don't look like you meet the weight requirement," one said, eyeing her slight frame. Emily's jaw tightened, her mind flashing to her father's pale face, the hospital lights, the guilt that had carved a hollow in her chest for 6 years. "I don't care about the rules. I can do this. Please let me try," she pleaded, her voice breaking as tears mixed with the rain. The medics exchanged glances, one shaking his head, citing regulations about her weight, barely 43 kilograms, too low for a safe donation. Emily's fists clenched, her eyes locked on the man, his face pale under the ambulance lights, his life slipping away. "I let someone die once because I was too scared," she whispered, her voice raw. "I won't do it again. Take what you can. I'll sign anything." The lead medic hesitated, then nodded. "We'll need a doctor's approval at the ER, but if you're serious, get in." Emily climbed into the ambulance, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, her hand brushing the man's cold fingers as they sped through the storm. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she leaned close, whispering, "You're not alone. You're going to make it, I promise." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and as the vehicle roared toward the hospital, Emily felt a strange calm, her fear drowned out by a resolve she hadn't known she carried, a chance to rewrite the moment she'd failed her father. David Ellison woke to the sharp sting of antiseptic and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, his body a map of aches, ribs throbbing, head heavy, a dull burn in his side. The hospital room was stark, white walls reflecting the cold glow of fluorescent lights, and for a moment he thought he was still in the rain, the world blurred and distant. A nurse adjusted his IV, her voice calm as she said, "Mr. Ellison, you're awake. You've been out for 3 days. Fractured ribs, internal bleeding. You're lucky to be here." David barely registered her words, his mind snagging on a fleeting memory. A woman's voice, soft but urgent. Cutting through the haze of that rainy night, her hand warm against his, anchoring him as the ambulance lights flashed. He didn't know her name, only that she'd been there, a stranger who hadn't left him to die. Across town, Emily Harper dragged herself through the back door of the seaside diner, her body still weak from the blood donation, her legs shaky as she tied on her apron. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, a familiar comfort, but her co-workers noticed the pallor in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled as she poured refills. "You okay, Em?" asked Sarah, the head cook, her brow furrowed. Emily forced a smile, brushing it off. Just tired, long night, unwilling to share the story of the man she'd saved, not wanting praise for something she felt was simply right. She moved through her shift mechanically, her thoughts drifting to the hospital, wondering if the man had woken, if he had a family, a life waiting for him. The guilt that had haunted her since her father's death felt quieter now, like a wound, finally scabbing over, but she didn't trust the piece. It felt too fragile, too new. Meanwhile, David lay in his hospital bed, his usual armor of control, built through years of running a tech empire, cracked by the memory of that voice. He was a man who lived behind walls, his wealth a fortress after losing his sister, Clara, in a car accident a decade ago, her death a wound he'd never let heal. No one had stopped for her, no one had cared, and he'd vowed never to rely on anyone again. Yet this stranger had stayed, had given him something no contract or bank account could buy, a second chance. He pressed the call button, his voice hoarse as he asked the nurse, "Who was with me in the ambulance? The woman, do you know her?" The nurse shook her head. "She didn't leave a name, just said she found you and left after you stabilized." David's jaw tightened. He needed to know her, not out of obligation, but because her act had stirred something he thought was long dead. Hope. He called Rachel, his assistant, a sharp woman with a knack for solving problems. "Find her," he said, his voice low, but firm. "Check hospital footage, talk to the paramedics. Start with the area near the accident. She's small, brown hair, probably local." Rachel nodded, used to his demands, but caught the unusual urgency in his tone. Back at the diner, Emily's shift ended, and she sat in the break room, sipping lukewarm tea, her fingers tracing the edge of a worn paperback she kept in her bag. Gift from her father, its pages yellowed but precious. She thought of Lily, her sister, studying late at the library, and felt a pang of pride mixed with sacrifice. Every extra shift she took was another textbook for Lily, another step toward a future Emily had once dreamed for herself. She didn't regret it, but sometimes in quiet moments she wondered who she might have been if life hadn't demanded so much. Across town, Rachel pieced together fragments from the hospital's security footage, spotting a slight figure in a soaked sweater, her face partially obscured by rain, kneeling beside David on the street. A paramedic's report mentioned a diner nearby, the seaside, where the woman had come from. Rachel relayed this to David, who lay staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the warmth of that stranger's hand, so different from the cold efficiency of his world. He didn't know why it mattered so much, only that it did, that her presence had reached past his wealth, his isolation, and touched the man he used to be before loss hardened him. Emily, unaware of the search, walked home under a clearing sky, the stars sharp against the night, her thoughts lingering on the man from the accident. She didn't need to know his name to feel connected to him. Saving him had been like saving a piece of herself, a redemption for the day she'd frozen when her father needed her most. At the hospital, David drifted back to sleep. The painkillers, pulling him under, but not before he murmured to Rachel, "Don't stop until you find her. I need to thank her. I need to know why she cared." The words felt foreign to him, a man who'd built a life on self-reliance, but they were true. Emily, now in her small apartment, curled up on the couch, her book unopened, her heart lighter but still heavy with the weight of what she'd done, what it meant. She didn't know that across town, a billionaire was searching for her, not to repay a debt but to understand the kind of courage that could break through a decade of grief. The seaside diner hummed with its usual morning rhythm, the clink of coffee mugs and the low chatter of truckers and locals filling the air as Emily Harper wove between tables, balancing a tray of pancakes and orange juice. Her hazel eyes, still shadowed from a sleepless night, brightened when a regular complimented her smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on the quiet peace she'd felt after saving a stranger's life. The bell above the door jingled, and she glanced up, her hands freezing mid-motion as a man stepped inside, his presence oddly out of place despite his simple attire. A navy sweater and jeans that didn't quite hide the tailored fit of wealth. David Ellison, his ribs still aching under the loose fabric, clutched a small handcrafted bookmark, its leather embossed with a tiny wave pattern, a gift he'd chosen after learning from Rachel that Emily loved books. He scanned the diner, his sharp blue eyes landing on her, recognizing the slight frame and dark ponytail from the hospital footage. Emily's brow furrowed as he approached, something familiar in his face stirring her memory. "You're Emily, right?" he said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made her pause. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, her guard up. "I'm David, the man from the accident. I came to thank you." His words hit her like a gust of sea wind, and she flushed, glancing away. "You didn't have to. I just did what anyone would." David shook his head, stepping closer, his sincerity disarming. "No one else stopped, you did. You saved my life." He held out the bookmark, a gesture small but deliberate, but Emily's eyes flicked to it with unease, sensing something more behind his visit. She took it, her fingers brushing the leather, but her voice stayed firm. "I don't need thanks. You're alive, that's enough." David hesitated, then pulled a slim envelope from his pocket, his instinct to solve things with money overriding his better judgment. "This is just a gesture to show my gratitude," he said, but Emily's face hardened, her hands dropping to her sides. "I didn't do it for a reward. Kindness isn't something you buy," she said, her tone sharp enough to make a nearby customer glance over. David froze, stunned by her refusal, his world of boardrooms and transactions useless against her. Quiet conviction. He slipped the envelope back into his pocket, his face softening with something like respect. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you," he murmured, and Emily's expression eased, sensing his genuine regret. She turned back to her work, but David lingered, ordering a coffee and settling into a corner booth, his eyes following her as she moved with a grace that belied her exhaustion. Over the next few days, he returned each morning, always with a black coffee, no sugar, sitting quietly with a laptop he barely touched. Their conversations started small, comments on the foggy weather, the diner's quirky regulars, a shared laugh when the ancient coffee machine sputtered. One slow afternoon, as Emily refilled his mug, David asked, "Why do you stay here working these hours?" She leaned against the counter, her gaze distant. "It's close to home, pays the bills, and lets me help my sister, Lily. She's studying to be a nurse, wants to save people like I couldn't." She stopped, catching herself, but David's quiet attention urged her on. "Like I couldn't save my dad," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't push, just nodded, his own memories of his sister Clara flickering in his silence. The next morning, Emily arrived to find the diner's old bookcase, a rickety wooden piece her mother had loved, now sagging under the weight of donated paperbacks. Standing upright, its shelves reinforced, the splintered edges sanded smooth. A folded note tucked into a shelf read, "Fixed to hold your stories." Her breath caught, her fingers tracing the repaired wood, and when she looked up, David was there, watching from his booth, his expression unguarded. "You did this?" she asked, and he shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't stand seeing it broken, thought it deserved a second chance like me." Emily's chest tightened, not with suspicion, but with something warmer, a recognition of someone trying to connect, not control. She slipped the note into her pocket, its words lingering as she poured his coffee, their eyes meeting in a moment of quiet understanding. David didn't mention his wealth, his company, or the empire he'd built. He wanted her to see him, not his status, and for the first time in years, he felt like a man, not a billionaire. Emily, wiping down the counter, felt the weight of her. Past lightened just a fraction. The bookcase a reminder that some things could be mended, even if imperfectly. Their small exchanges grew into a routine, a tether pulling them closer, not because of what she'd done, but because of who she was. Someone who gave without expecting. Someone who made David want to be more than the sum of his losses. The sea. Seaside Diner's back steps were cool under the evening sky, the salty breeze carrying the distant crash of waves, as Emily Harper sat beside David Ellison, their shoulders almost touching. The diner had just closed, and the world felt softer in the twilight, the stars peeking through a bruised purple sky. Emily sipped chamomile tea from a chipped mug, her fingers warmed by the ceramic, while David held a takeout cup, his usual. Black coffee swapped for tea at her insistence. Their conversations had grown longer, deeper, no longer confined to the diner's bustle. Emily spoke of her mother, who'd filled their home with laughter and dog-eared novels before cancer stole her away, leaving Emily to raise Lily alone. "She used to read to us every night, even when she was too weak to hold the book," Emily said, her voice steady but soft, her eyes tracing the horizon. David listened, his usual guarded posture gone, and shared a memory of his sister Clara, her love for sketching wildflowers, her sketchbook the only thing he'd kept after her death. "I couldn't save her," he admitted, his voice low, "and I've been running from that ever since." Emily met his gaze, her silence an invitation, not a judgment, and something shifted between them, a bridge built on shared scars. David started spending more time at the diner, not just as a customer but as a quiet helper, washing dishes when Sarah was swamped or fixing a wobbly table without fanfare. Emily noticed how his hands, more used to signing contracts than scrubbing, pans moved with care, as if he was rediscovering a part of himself. One evening, as they stacked chairs after closing, David paused, his eyes bright with an idea. "What if we started something, a way to make sure people like me, like Clara, get help in time, a network for rare blood types connecting donors to emergencies?" Emily tilted her head, wary of his world of wealth and influence. "Sounds like something for big shots, not a Waitress," she said, half teasing. But David shook his head. "It needs someone like you, someone who knows what it means to give without strings. I can handle the money, the logistics, but you'd be the heart of it." She hesitated, her mind flashing to hospital bills and Lily's tuition. But his sincerity, his belief in her, cracked her defenses. "Okay, but no fancy galas, no press, just real help for real people," she said, and David grinned, his relief palpable. They named it LifeLink, a system to alert donors with rare blood types in real time, and began working together, their evenings filled with planning sessions at the diner's counter, papers spread between coffee stains. Emily brought her instinct for what people needed, clear instructions, trust, no bureaucracy, while David secured hospital partnerships and tech to make it work. Their collaboration was seamless, punctuated by small moments. Emily teaching him to brew tea properly, David slipping a new paperback onto her bookcase when she wasn't looking. One night, under a pier where a LifeLink mobile unit was being tested, they sat on a driftwood log, the glow of LED lights casting shadows on their faces. Emily spoke of Lily's latest exam, her pride shining through, and David admitted he'd started sketching again, inspired by Clara's memory and Emily's warmth. "You make me want to be better," he said, his voice barely above the waves, and Emily's breath caught, her hand brushing his for a moment before she pulled back, unsure of the warmth spreading in her chest. Their work with LifeLink grew, saving lives in quiet ways. A truck driver in Portland, a teacher in Astoria, and Emily found herself waking with purpose, her guilt over her father fading like a tide going out. David, too, changed, his phone no longer buzzing with urgent calls, his suits replaced with sweaters as he learned to set up blood drives alongside volunteers. One morning, as they delivered training manuals to a local clinic, Emily caught him laughing with a nervous donor, his ease a far cry from the guarded man she'd first met. She realized she was seeing him, not the billionaire, but David, the man who fixed bookcases, who listened, who stayed. Their bond deepened in these shared moments, not just in their mission but in the quiet spaces between, sharing a thermos of tea under the stars, David confessing he'd never felt so alive. Emily admitting she'd forgotten what it felt like to trust someone new. They were no longer just partners in a cause, but two people finding solace in each other's presence, their pasts no longer anchors, but maps guiding them forward. As they walked back to the diner one night, the wind carrying the scent of salt and possibility, Emily felt a spark she hadn't known she could feel, and David, glancing at her, saw a future he hadn't dared imagine since Clara's death. The coastal wind whipped through the empty lot beside a rural clinic, where Emily Harper and David Ellison stood amid the hum of a LifeLink mobile unit, its white tent glowing under portable lights. The initiative had grown, saving lives across small towns, but tonight tested its limits. A call had come an hour ago. A 9-year-old girl, Mia, collapsed from severe anemia, her rare AB negative blood type matching Emily's, with no donors nearby, and the nearest hospital's supply depleted. Emily's face was pale but resolute as she checked the donor database on a tablet, her fingers trembling from the cold and the weight of memory. David coordinated with the clinic staff, his voice steady as he relayed logistics, but his eyes kept flicking to Emily, noting the tension in her jaw. The clinic's doctor emerged, his expression grim. "She's critical. We need blood now, or she won't make it through the night." Emily's heart lurched, the image of her father's lifeless face flashing in her mind, the hospital room where she'd failed him years ago. "I'm a match," she said, stepping forward, her voice firm despite the fatigue still lingering from her last donation weeks ago. David's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. "Emily, you're barely recovered. It's too risky. You're still underweight." She shook her head, her eyes fierce. "I'm not letting a child die because I'm scared. I've lived with that once, never again." The doctor hesitated, citing regulations, but Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I'll sign whatever you need, just do it." David grabbed her arm gently, his voice low. "You could pass out, go into shock. This isn't just about you helping, it's about you surviving." Emily pulled free, her voice rising, raw with emotion. "You don't get it, David. I've carried my dad's death every day. I froze when he needed me. I won't freeze now. Not for Mia. Not for anyone." The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding, and David's face tightened, torn between his fear for her and the truth in her eyes. The doctor, sensing the urgency, agreed to a partial draw under strict monitoring, leading Emily to a cot inside the tent. As the needle pierced her skin, Emily closed her eyes, her breathing shallow, images of her father blending with Mia's small frame in the clinic. David stood nearby, his hands clenched, watching the monitor tracking her vitals, his own heart racing with a fear he hadn't felt since Clara's accident. The procedure was quick. The small bag of blood rushed to Mia's bedside, and Emily lay back, dizzy but calm, a quiet strength settling in her chest. The doctor returned minutes later, his face softer. "Mia's stabilizing. That unit bought her time. She's going to pull through." Emily exhaled, tears prickling her eyes, relief washing over her like a warm tide. David knelt beside her, his hand hovering near hers, not touching but close. "You're incredible," he whispered, his voice thick, "but you scared the hell out of me." She managed a faint smile. "Good means you care." That night, back at the diner's empty break room, David sat across from Emily, who sipped water, her color slowly returning. He was quiet, his usual confidence replaced by something vulnerable. Later, outside under a sky dusted with stars, he turned to Rachel, who'd driven them back. "I'm in love with her," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not just because she saved me, but because of who she is, every day, every choice." Rachel nodded, her eyes knowing. "Then tell her, David, don't wait." Emily, unaware of his confession, sat on the diner's steps, her thoughts on Mia, on the life she'd helped save, and on David, who'd stood by her, not as a billionaire, but as a partner who saw her heart. The crisis had cracked something open in her, a realization that her guilt was no longer a chain but a fire, driving her to act, to give. David, too, felt a shift, his fear for Emily revealing a depth of feeling he hadn't allowed since Clara's death. He saw now that LifeLink wasn't just a project. It was a lifeline, not just for strangers but for him, tying him to Emily, to purpose, to a world he'd closed off long ago. As they parted for the night, Emily touched his sleeve, a small gesture. "Thanks for not stopping me," she said, and David smiled, his eyes soft. "I wouldn't dare, you're unstoppable." They stood in the quiet, the night wrapping around them, and Emily felt a warmth she couldn't name, a sense that this moment, this partnership, was building something neither could have foreseen. David walked away, his heart full, knowing he couldn't keep his feelings silent much longer, not when every moment with Emily made him want to live differently, fully, for the first time. The grand hall in Portland glowed under soft chandelier light, its high ceilings echoing with the murmur of voices. Doctors, volunteers, and families gathered to celebrate LifeLink's first anniversary. Emily Harper stood at the back, her simple navy dress a quiet contrast to the polished crowd, her volunteer badge pinned crookedly to her chest. She clutched a program, her fingers tracing the LifeLink logo, a heartbeat woven through clasped hands, her heart racing with pride and nerves. David Ellison, in a tailored grey suit, stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet warm, his eyes scanning the room until they found her. He began his speech, his voice steady but rich with emotion. "A year ago, I was a man who measured life in deals and dollars, disconnected from the world, until a stranger gave me her blood, her courage, and a reason to believe again." The crowd hushed, sensing the weight of his words. Emily's cheeks warmed, her eyes dropping to the floor, unprepared for the spotlight. David continued, "LifeLink isn't just a system, it's a promise born from one woman's heart, a woman who showed me that kindness doesn't need a price tag." He paused, then smiled, a rare vulnerability breaking through. "Emily Harper, will you join me up here?" The room turned and Emily froze, her breath catching as a volunteer nudged her forward. Her legs felt unsteady, but she walked to the stage, the applause swelling around her like a tide. David took her hand, his touch gentle, and whispered, "Sorry for the surprise, I couldn't wait." She laughed softly, her nerves easing, and he turned back to the microphone. "This is Emily, the soul of LifeLink, the woman who didn't just save my life but taught me how to live it." The crowd's applause grew, but Emily shook her head, mouthing, "It's not just me." David's smile deepened, and then, in a moment that silenced the hall, he stepped back and knelt, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. A simple sapphire ring glinted under the lights, its blue mirroring the coastal sky they'd grown to love. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling with a sincerity that reached every corner of the room, "you gave me a second chance, not just with your blood, but with every moment since. You're my purpose, my home. Will you marry me?" Emily gasped, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled, her mind flashing to the diner, the bookcase, the nights under the stars, and the guilt she'd carried since her father's death. That guilt was gone now, replaced by a love she hadn't dared imagine, a love that saw her not as a waitress or a failure, but as enough. She knelt too, meeting him eye to eye, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "I couldn't save my dad, but loving you, building this with you, it's my second chance, yes, I'll marry you." The hall erupted, cheers and camera flashes, filling the air not for headlines, but for a moment of pure connection. David slipped the ring onto her finger and they stood, hands clasped, as a LifeLink banner unfurled behind them, its heartbeat logo a testament to their shared journey. Months later, Emily and David stood outside a new LifeLink mobile unit, parked in a small coastal town, its tent bustling with volunteers training new donors. Emily knelt beside a young boy, a recent survivor, holding his hand as he smiled shyly, his mother tearful with gratitude. David watched, no longer the billionaire defined by wealth but a man shaped by love, his sketches of wildflowers now filling a notebook he carried everywhere. Their wedding had been simple, in the diner's backyard, with Lily as maid of honor, and Sarah the cook, sneaking extra frosting on the cake. The repaired bookcase stood nearby holding a new book, a journal they'd started together, its pages filled with stories of lives saved, including their own. Emily placed the journal on the shelf, a note tucked inside. "For every life we touch, we live again." LifeLink had grown, its network stretching across states, saving dozens with its rapid response system, Yet Emily remained unchanged, still, pouring coffee when she wasn't at clinics, still listening to people's stories with her whole heart. David, too, had transformed, trading boardroom calls for late-night strategy sessions with volunteers, his thermos always filled with chamomile tea, a nod to Emily's influence. As they walked away from the mobile unit, the sunset painting, the sky in hues of orange and blue, Emily leaned into David, her ring catching the light. "Do you think Clara and my dad would be proud?" she asked, her voice soft. David squeezed her hand, his eyes steady. "They'd be more than proud. They'd see what we've built, not just Lifelink, but us." The legacy of their love was not in the lives saved, though there were many, but in the invisible threads tying strangers together through courage and care. Emily and David were no longer just a waitress and a billionaire, but two people who'd found redemption in each other, living a promise made in a rainy ambulance now spoken aloud under an open sky.